We came early so that, is it working now? Well, we forgot to test the microphone. Now it's working? Okay, thank you, it's working, it's working. So welcome everyone, thanks for coming on this steamy night. My name is Val Vetter, and I'm the president of Poweshiek Cares. I think most of you know about Poweshiek Cares, but I'll just say that we've been working since 2012 to stop the expansion and growth of more CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations, sometimes called factory farms. In the interest of the health and well-being of people, animals, communities, our environment. But part of our mission is also to promote healthier ways to raise livestock and produce food. CARES actually is an acronym for Community Action to Restore Environmental Stewardship. So we have some pretty lofty goals. And some of that, and because of that, we have long also worked to educate ourselves and others in our community about sustainable approaches to agriculture. And we think that food hubs are an important development in being part of a system that is going to be more sustainable for our community. So we're really happy to have Tommy Hexter here tonight to give us an overview of how food hubs are changing our food distribution system. Tommy has been a CARES board member since 2020. And I wrote this down, but he is the Poweshiek Soil and Water Conservation District Commissioner, in addition to being the Iowa Farmer Union Rural Coordinator, or Organizer, and educator. And if that isn't enough, he's also co-owner of the local food hub, Grinnell Farm to Table. Tommy is passionate about farming, about farmers, about the land, and how we grow our food. So join me in welcoming Tommy up to the podium to talk to him about food hubs.
Well, Val, thank you very much for the generous introduction, and thanks to Poweshiek Cares and to you all for being here tonight to learn about food hubs. As Val said, I will put a quick shameless plug in here for Grinnell Farm to Table. It is our local food hub, and we'll talk a little bit more about that going further into the talk. So, what is a food hub? People have been asking that question for a long time. I think probably most people in this room have heard the term food hub, but there is some misconceptions or questions, or really people are wondering, what are they doing? Where are they? How are they acting? And so I just wanted to take tonight to give a little bit of a Food Hub 101 for you all. So this is an introductory course at best. It's not going to help you start a food hub. There's not going to be any super specific things, but kind of we're going to go through the context of where the need for food hubs came from, the situation of what's currently going on with Iowa's food hubs, what they're working on in terms of food sales, increasing statewide distribution networks, and working with the U.S. government to purchase local food for food banks and local schools. And then lastly, we'll just kind of conclude and talk a little bit about why are these important and how can our community become more invested in them. I want this to be as open a conversation as possible, so if you have any questions or comments as I'm going through, please holler at me and just raise your hand. That would be great. So let's start where it is always important to start, and I'm looking at Sophie Nemes out there, with the context. Context is a very important concept in anthropology. It helps make sure we're all on the same page for this conversation. So tonight we'll be talking about food supply chains. And so if you're not here to learn about food supply chains, you might be in the wrong place. There's two kinds of food supply chains that I'd like to focus the beginning of our conversation on. The first would be on top here, the long food supply chain. And obviously, in contrast to long, we have the short food supply chain. These are very different orders of getting food, but they are primarily the two ways that people in the U.S. are procuring their food today. So let me start with the long food supply chain. You can see it starts on a farm. Sometimes those farms would be 4,000 acres, grain or other commodity production. Sometimes they'd be 5,000 head livestock farms. Sometimes they'd be big dairy operations. But generally speaking, the farms for the long food supply chains are larger farms. They're farms that are doing a lot in annual revenue, and then they're able to get their scale up to the point where they are distributing their food essentially worldwide. And so once it leaves the farm, it enters into this little streamlined chain. I really like this graphic, but it goes into manufacturing, it goes into packaging. Sometimes it will cross an ocean, then it will be handled on the other end. Then it will go through maybe several different food distributors. And then eventually it'll make it to some sort of grocery store or a restaurant or a food service institution, a hospital, and find its way to a mouth. In general, that food is traveling over 1,000 miles, and that is a large proportion of the food that we're eating in the United States travels over 1,000 miles. Also important to note for long food supply chains is that the average share of the food dollar that the farmer gets is under 15 cents. So there's a lot of value being lost every time it goes to a new spot. Now, the short food supply chains are pretty stark contrast. The technical definition is that they go through less than one intermediary, or one or less intermediary, between the farm and the end product. And so I chose the most common one to depict here, a farmer's market. You could also think of this, maybe a restaurant would be a pretty short food supply chain. And obviously the shortest food supply chain is if you're growing it in your backyard and harvesting it. And so with that, the average distance your food travels is just very small, sometimes 0 miles. And I would say generally 50 is about as far as a farmer would travel to sell to a restaurant or in a farmer's market. Maybe a little further, it could go up to 100 or so, and in big cities maybe 200 miles. But a nice thing about these short food supply chains is that the farmers are going to make 100% of the profit on their sales, for the most part. Sometimes, like if a restaurant adds value to it by putting it in a dish or something, then maybe they'll make 80 cents to $1 or something. There's two other important things to note on this slide. The first is that these supply chains only show from farm to table. They also both go back in this direction with the inputs. And so farmers are having to buy fertilizer, equipment, chemicals, land, all of these things that cost money in addition. And so for the large farmers in the long food supply chain, that's all coming out of that just 14.3 cents to the dollar they're making. But they're doing it at such a scale that they're able to continue making money. And in the short food supply chains, a lot of farms are spending all of the money that they're making, putting it back into seeds and larger equipment. Another thing is, I think, adding to this is the historical context. This is not how it's always been in the U.S. I think if you look back 150 years ago in Iowa, you'd see a very different scenario of what the food supply chains were. There wasn't always ships taking food across the ocean. There wasn't big trucking routes. And so a lot more food was within that probably 0 to 200 mile supply chain range. And I imagine that there would have been, back then, something like a mid-food supply chain where farms were, not a quarter of an acre, but not 4,000 acres, somewhere in between, and they were growing a diversity of food. But largely, in today's market, that agriculture of the middle has disappeared. And so that's a little bit of the context. For all intents and purposes, these are basically how we're getting our food these days, farmers markets or large distribution networks. And so I'd just like to take a minute and look at two different ways to compare kind of how they're working. And the first metric I look at is sustainability. And sustainability has kind of become a buzzword, and so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I think if we look into these two kinds of supply chains, we see some important areas of difference in terms of what these supply chains are doing sustainability-wise. So let's start with the economics. I think that a large reason long food supply chains have taken such priority is their economic prowess. They are profit maximizing, they take advantage of economies of scale, they take advantage of divisions of labor, and they're able to keep the price really low all along the supply chain. So it leads for the cost of food to be able to stay pretty low for producers or for consumers, and profits to be high enough for producers to get by. Although in recent years, with consolidation in the food system, producers have had a harder and harder time making money. Short food supply chains are not so good for the farmers in terms of making a profit, and also generally the prices are not as accessible for consumers. And that's a lot of the concerns that people have with farmers markets. They aren't accessible to people of all income levels. But then if we look to the environment, I also want to stop here and say that a lot of what's required for this slide is me making generalizations. And so there are outliers in the long and short food supply chains. I'm just kind of generalizing. So if we look at the environmental impacts of the long food supply chains, we've got obviously traveling over 1,000 miles to get an apple to a table. That's a large environmental impact, just the fuel. But then you consider the impact of the large farms, and that would be, clear cutting, in often cases, a natural environment and replacing it with tillable farmland. And so I think that environmentally, large food supply chains are oftentimes not the ideal. Now, the shorter food supply chains often focus more on environmental and social sustainability. And so those are things where the farmers are so small, they aren't focusing so much on the economy, and they are really valuing both the social and environmental aspects. So I'm going to curb my discussion of sustainability here, and just real quickly, if I had to put short food supply chains somewhere on this Venn diagram, I would put them somewhere over here, being focused on social and environmental values. And if I had to put the long food supply chain somewhere, I'd put them in the top right corner with the economic side. And so to achieve sustainability, you need to be in the middle, and I don't think either of our current food supply chains are reaching that. The next metric I want to look at is whether these food supply chains are doing a good job at feeding people. This is a pie chart I made. Long food supply chains account for 97% of sales in U.S. agriculture today. And so clearly they are doing the lion's share of actually getting food to the table. So as much as, you might push back against this, I think it's important to give props to these long food supply chains for how much food they're getting across. McDonald's feeds millions of people every day in ways that short food supply chain farmers are just not able to do. And you kind of have to be a little bit of a dark Jedi to consider possibilities like learning from the long food supply chains. But also in this, it's important to recognize that having this much of a share of the food system be in long food supply chains opens up a lot of vulnerability for our food system. And during COVID, we remember along the supply chain, different things were breaking down, whether it be fertilizer plants or meat packing plants. It was either on the input end or the marketing side, where we were seeing food not making it through the entire long food supply chain. And so at times of distress, I think it's important to realize that long food supply chains are not always doing their job of feeding people. And so I would argue that, again, like sustainability, neither of these types of supply chains is going to be long-term viable for feeding people. So we have kind of a Goldilocks issue here, if you will. And we have one supply chain that is seemingly too long, and we have another supply chain that is seemingly too short. And we need to figure out what is in the middle. And I think to do so, we're looking for the mid-sized food supply chain. So I really like this graphic. You may have seen it before, but it comes from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And what we're really looking for when we're talking about a mid-sized food supply chain is the middle line between a farmer's market and a Sysco. And I'll just read this quote here real quick to kind of illustrate why that's important. Efforts to increase the production, distribution, and purchasing of local and regional food are increasingly focused on Tier 2. This tier can potentially provide the connections to family farms, transparency about production systems, and values found at Tier 1, which is the farmer's market, while accommodating higher product volumes and, in some cases, greater production and processing efficiencies. So being at that Tier 2 level, it allows you to keep the economic and efficiency value of Sysco, but also maintain the environmental and social values that you find with smaller farmers and farmers markets. It's kind of this Tier 2 is pretty new to the U.S. food system. There hasn't been, but within the last 2 decades, I think, a movement to combine economic efficiency and the value of source-identified food. So it's a novel idea there. And I think that it's important to ask, well, what is the engine going to look like to operate in Tier 2? And the answer is food hubs. So now we've made it to the point of why we're all here. And sorry for the lengthy introduction to get us here. Food hubs act as the supply chain manager, and they provide a logistical and organizational platform for the aggregation and distribution of source-identified food products from local and regional producers to both wholesale buyers, like institutions, food service firms, restaurants, hotels, pubs, and end consumers, which would be your retail customers. And so there's a few things I want to break down about what a food hub does based on this definition. The first, give me 1 second. The first is the logistical and organizational platform. So food hubs both offer the trucking, the cold storage, the dry storage, the actual floor space, the physical market itself, the website, all of these kind of logistical things necessary to sell food on a massive scale. They also provide an organizational platform, which allows for like a uniform brand. It allows for connections with larger scale producers. And it oftentimes means that if you're working with a food hub, you're going to be able to have connections with policymakers, because these food hubs are doing policy work and getting grants for their producers. And so those are just a couple of, that's really the big picture of what food hubs do. And then they work with a number of producers to aggregate food. They basically say, bring us the local food. And then they work to distribute that food. And they do that both wholesale and retail. And so farmers and local farmers in particular have trouble trying to balance the act of both growing and marketing all of their food. You know, those are two individual professions in and of themselves. And to be skilled at both of those things requires probably, you know, two different professional trainings. I mean, it really is two professions in one. And so the fact that food hubs are working to do that marketing side really alleviates a lot of the stress on the farmer. And I want to talk about some of the things that are happening in Iowa's food hubs that illuminate just the kind of service that food hubs are providing to farmers. And I think this is what makes food hubs so exciting and opens the possibility for way greater distribution of local foods in our state. I'm going to start with this hub-to-hub distribution network. And real quick, the Food Hub Managers Working Group is all of these food hubs listed here, which I will point out, we have Grinnell Farm to Table made it on the map there. We are just a hublet, though, you may say. But they cover a lot of the state, not so much the northwest corner and not so much the two bottom rows of counties. But these networks, there's about 8 of them listed on this map, and a couple nodes. And there's also other groups that are doing a similar function that just aren't on this map. But all of these groups get together to form what's called the Food Hub Managers Working Group. And we're working together almost like one organization to make sure projects do get done. The first thing, and probably the most exciting thing, is this hub-to-hub distribution network that is being built. And so, say I'm Farmer Tom, and I grow X amount of carrots because that is what my local food hub can sell. And so I've been working with my local food hub, and they say you can grow X amount of carrots for us. Now, this hub-to-hub project is a way to connect the one hub with all of the other hubs in the state. And so now that immediately opens the marketing opportunities for a farmer up to these other, 7 or 8 hubs. And so, whereas if I'm previously working as just, if I'm growing 500 pounds of carrots, now I can maybe grow 5,000 pounds of carrots, because that is the kind of network that this project builds. And so practically what's happening is that every week there's one route running from Kelowna to Des Moines, and sometimes it actually goes up to Ames and back through Cedar Rapids as well. And then there's another route going from Decorah down through Cedar Rapids and into Iowa City. And so this allows for the distribution of product from all of these hubs essentially along the entire corridor. And so if I'm one hub, I can buy from another hub every single week. And that has really opened the door for producers to scale up. Now, the next thing I'd like to talk about is the LFPA, which is a federal grant that comes from the USDA, and it's part of the American Rescue Plan and the COVID relief dollars. And this is another project that food hubs have been working on for several years now, since 2020 when it first got announced. And the basic premise of the project is that the federal government is going to use its purchasing power to buy local food and give it to food banks. And it's an investment by the federal government in local food and in nutrition for food banks. And so just this last year, Iowa received $2 million over the next 3 years to buy local food through food hubs and then distribute that local food out through food banks. And so what this does, basically it allows farmers to now be marketing to yet another source, which is these food banks. It allows food hubs now to build a permanent relationship with food banks. And then, most importantly, probably, it provides a healthy and nutritious option through the food banks at a scale of $2 million in 3 years, which I don't think that Iowa or any state local food system has ever seen an investment like that from the federal government. And the food hubs are the ones who are administering the money and making sure that all that food gets there. I know in Grinnell, Jordan Scheibel is very excited about this because it essentially means that whatever food he's growing now will be purchased and it will go to a food hub. And he can increase his capacity up and up, and it will still be purchased for a fair price using this money. And I think it's a novel idea. It also displays the fact that the U.S. government thinks it's important that local and regional food systems develop like this.
Tommy?
Yeah?
What, like that amount of money, what percent is that of what the food hubs sell now?
There hasn't been a whole study about that since 2015, and I think they're gearing up to do one. Back then, food hubs were doing about $10 million in sale a year, so this would have been another 20%. The way that people have been talking about it recently is that this is going to be a big lift to be able to procure that much more local food over the next 3 years. Because generally speaking, the food hubs have been selling the food that they're getting, and so they're going to have to scale up both them and their producers. And so Jordan has said this several times, but they're kind of learning to build the plane as we fly, but it's a unique opportunity to build the infrastructure that will bring us the food hubs to a better place in a few years. And I'll just show real quick, in case it's of interest to anybody, kind of the flow of funds here. So the flow of local, so here comes the money comes from the USDA, and then it goes into the Iowa Department of Agriculture, and then it goes out through food hubs, through food banks, and also through the Meskwaki Nation to purchase local food and from farmers and producers. And then if we go back to this one, then once the food's been purchased, the farmer then gives it out to a distributor, either working directly with the food bank, with the Meskwaki Nation, or most often with food hubs, to the community access partner, which is a food bank or food pantry, and then it goes straight out to Iowans. So it's I don't know if I did the best job explaining that. Does it make sense generally speaking? Okay, it's a neat program. I think it's a yeah, Sophie, please. I was going to say, I think it's an ode to what former Iowa Governor Tom Vilsack is trying to invest in local and regional food systems in his second time around. It's unprecedented. Sophie?
I'm curious if you've heard any talk of this program continuing after 3 years, because it seems like they're going to build a whole bunch of infrastructure and expand farms, but then the money will disappear.
Yeah, I think that is a really important question. I'll repeat it. Sophie asked if there's talk about this program continuing after 3 years. And people have been asking that question because why would you want to scale up if this market is going to disappear? I think that people are optimistic that even if it doesn't get continued after 3 years, that the connections with food banks will not disappear, that food banks will continue buying food. There's no guarantee of that. I know that there's advocacy happening, and in my non-food hub hat with the Iowa Farmers Union, we do some of this advocacy to try and work programs like this into the next Farm Bill in 2023. And so it's unclear what investment they're going to make in that Farm Bill, but I think depending on how this goes for improving local and regional food systems, there's a really good chance that it will continue in some form in the future. The last thing I want to take a minute and do is, this is a little more fun maybe, because I've just been talking at you all a lot. But I actually want to show you some of what's available through Iowa's food hubs, because honestly, this is the most important and impressive thing. I don't think a lot of normal consumers realize how much you can get locally. So we'll start with a wholesale list, and I'll blow this up. But just take a look at the kinds of products you can get here, and I'll read some of them off. And this is all wholesale. I'll show retail in a second. But so say you want hazelnut oil. You can buy 12 pounds of it here. I've never even heard of hazelnut oil. Honey, 45 pounds of honey. Maple syrup, 5-gallon buckets of maple syrup. Tortillas, there's eggs, organic eggs here. Obviously the tofu we get here in Grinnell, organic, made in Iowa. Local dairy, there's all these kinds of milk. We get into cottage cheese. We get into cheddars and mozzarella, Munster, and Parmesan. Butter, cheese curds, cream cheese. And you'll notice, I just want to point out, some of this is from Wisconsin as well. This is from Iowa Food Hub, and they're in the northeast corner of the state. And so they do work with some producers right over the border. Yogurts. We've got frozen yogurt. We've got Greek yogurt, sour cream. All these kinds of beef, salami, pepperoni, sausage, beef patties, pork roast. It's just amazing. The list just goes on, and then we haven't even gotten to produce yet. And I'm sitting here just, thinking, if I were to own a grocery store or a restaurant, how much I would want to know that this existed, and how much I don't think people know that this exists. And if I had a grocery store, I think I could fill it with no other products other than what's on this list, and it would be a successful grocery store. And another thing is that the prices are pretty good for the wholesale quantities. And so that, as you can see, is pretty impressive, all the things that are made right here in Iowa. And this is partially a display of the work that food hubs have been doing, because people wouldn't be growing this stuff unless there was a market for it. And it's taken 7 to 8 years to build a list like this. And when this list first started, even earlier this spring, it was only 1 page, and now it's 3. And so they're getting more producers rapidly as they built this network. I mean, it's happening now. And I will also just go ahead and show you real quick. This is the Iowa Food Co-op, and they are a retail food hub. That's how I define them. And this is their homepage, where you can just kind of let your brain soak in how many different options of products there are here. Look at all the different baked goods and local produce. Again, dairy. They've got salads and sides. They've got all these different prepared foods that come from local restaurants. Snacks like hummus and dips, organic grains, flour, and pastas. And it's just amazing what's grown here in Iowa. So I wanted to, Sophie, please.
I have another question. Are people talking at all about seasonality? We are in Iowa and we can't really grow some of these things when it's cold.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, September is the time of year where the lists are the biggest, obviously, so I chose a good time to show you all that list. But there's a lot of products that will continue being produced throughout the winter, like meat and dairy. But you ask an important question about whether we can continue selling local food, like produce, I think, is a good example, through the winter. And we aren't there yet to be able to do that. But 50 years ago, or 60 years ago, John, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Grinnell had a local sweet corn cannery.
You had a cannery that did other things too.
Yeah, and was that rare for?
No, there were small canneries all over the state.
And so there is some, on this website you can find tomato sauce, for instance, and salsa, but we haven't gotten yet to the point of canned corn but I think that food hubs open up the door for other food enterprises that don't currently exist in the state, like light processing. Another one that I know Jason Grimm down in southern Iowa is growing black beans now, and he dries them out, and so he can sell those all winter long as well. But yeah, that's another important thing about food hubs is that they do go year round, whereas farmers markets are just 4 or 5 months of the year. Joyce?
When you were doing the wholesale, 5-gallon bucket of honey, so if they sell that to a food hub, so then who's putting this into our containers that we're buying from you?
Yeah, that's a good point. And so that would probably, the 5-gallon container of honey would be going to like a coffee shop or something.
Oh, okay.
And
So you wouldn't be handling it again, you would
No.
just, okay.
there may be some food hub who would maybe want to do that, but no one's doing that right now. But like, for instance, on that list as well, there was these big old things of cheese that I'm always interested in. Yeah. I just think about Jay's Deli, but like a 5-pound block of cheddar or mozzarella, like might he be interested in selling those or using those on his sandwiches because they're really good. Thanks for asking, Joyce. Open that up, please.
And this might be more of a specific question, but, there's all of these things out there, and I know you're kind of talking about it in a sense of like, this is what's possible. So like, if, as a customer for Farm to Table, one is interested in the black beans that you said, for example, how does one even, how would we like let you know that that's what we're interested in, you add it to the online store or something, or like, so?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, you'll give me a chance to color kind of our local food hub in a little bit here. So Grinnell Farm to Table, John and I have owned it for the last roughly 2 years now. It started in 2008 by Jordan Scheibel and maybe some other people, and also Donna's daughter, Angela, which is great. And we're now the 3rd generation of owners. I think that we are at a point with Grinnell Farm to Table where John and I are basically running it as volunteers, and we're moving towards trying to do some of this more novel stuff. But we're going to have to invest in our food hub as a community if we want to see those changes happen. Because we are pretty much, in terms of trying to work into the distribution routes, we're getting a delivery once every month on Wednesdays, but we have to get in on the other one to get more products. And it's every single product you add on adds hours. And so we've kind of capped out where we're at with our current business structure.
Oh, you mentioned that maybe it was the short and it wasn't the medium, that most of the dollar goes to the farmer, but I don't see how that could be with the medium range, because this has to be overhead. There are people that are running all these things and the transportation. Maybe you're going to talk about this later, and of course it really is very relevant to Grinnell Farm to Table. It's like, how does that work in terms of staff?
No, that's a great question.
And how that is worked into, how that's funded.
Yeah, so let's go back to that slide. If I can. But yeah, we were talking about the 2 different kinds of supply chains here, and the
So
farmer
that's-
share.
That's different, short is different from medium.
Well, yeah, because short, it's just, I'll give you a sweet potato and you give me $2. But you're right, when it goes through a food hub, they have to make their staff payments, they have to pay for their overhead. And right now, Grinnell Farm to Table has no overhead.
Is Grinnell Farm to Table the only food hub that is totally run by volunteers?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
we are. We are unique in that way, and
Well,
it
maybe not sustainable.
yes. Yeah, I'm glad that this is getting brought up because I think it's something that we can think about as a Poweshiek County community about the next steps for making it more sustainable. But yeah, I think if you were to go to that mid-food supply chain, the average share of dollar a farmer is getting, if it's only going from the farm through a hub to a customer, it's probably going to be more like 75 cents, or maybe 65 to 75. So it's better. And you also don't have to do the job of marketing it on your own. You don't have to go to the farmer's market every week. You can spend a lot more time growing food in that way. So I've got one more slide, and then I'm going to open it up for questions and further conversation. But I just wanted to wrap up just kind of a brief ending point here, really what food hubs are offering to Iowa. For producers, they're offering improved and new marketing conditions. They are, like I just said, taking out the need to go to a farmer's market. They're also now offering access to markets around the state. Just working with one food hub, now you can sell to 10 food hubs. And they also do work with producers about crop planning, so you kind of know about your guaranteed market, what you can grow every year and sell every year. That's always if you're working at a farmer's market, you don't have that. You don't know what's going to sell week to week. And then I think the last point there, ability to scale up or scale over, is potentially the most exciting one. Scaling up being that now that you've got these markets, you can grow your business, you can invest in capital, you can get a tractor, you can build a shed, you can hire staff, or you can scale over. And that's something I think is relevant to CARES when we're thinking about most of Iowa's landscape and farms right now. They're large conventional farms. And we often hear that in order to keep a second generation on the farm, they need to build things like CAFOs or factory farms. And I think that food hubs now are offering a new market where instead of putting up a CAFO, maybe you can grow a field of strawberries instead and sell it through these food hubs. And you'd probably make more money, and it would be way less of an initial investment and initial debt. So I'm excited to see. I know that Roger Van Donselaar here in Grinnell with Prairie Produce has kind of scaled over a little bit of his production with Prairie Produce. And I don't know his entire history, so I could be wrong on that. But I'm excited to see what conventional farmers start to grow now that there's an option to grow something else. For consumers, there's all these new options. All the things we just looked at. You can now get it delivered to your door. You'll see it on grocery store shelves and in restaurants. And it's starting to become available in places even like Grinnell College. They serve the local Iowa City tofu. So that's really exciting. And then the last is for our communities. Like Sophie asked with the canning and processing, I think that food hubs open the door for new industry and maybe bringing back some industry that previously existed around food, whether it be restaurants or processing or maybe further meat packing, butchering. I don't know. I've thought it would be cool to open a bagel shop with some of the organic grains that we're able to get here in Iowa. There's also the benefit of social connections between the producers and the residents, and the benefit of the improved diversity of the cropland in the community, which generally speaking leads to improved environmental conditions. There's not so much use of chemicals and fertilizers or monoculture. And then lastly, it is a circular flow economy, and so all the money that you're spending on your food now is going to stay in your town or in your state, versus right now most of that 85 cents to the dollar that is being swallowed up in the long food supply chains is going out of the state. So if we want to invest in Iowa, it's time to invest in the local food systems. And I think I used to really believe, and I still do believe in the America Needs Farmers slogan. I went to college and I grew up on a hobby vegetable and egg farm, and I thought when I was done with college I would start a farm. But I quickly learned it wasn't as easy to start a farm when there's no market. And so I think before we take the step and have more farmers, we need to invest in the food hubs as well. So thank you all for being here, and I will take your questions or food for thought.
I'm Devin. I'm not from here, but I know some of you. I've been in this room a lot, specifically. My question is, I used to work on a farm in Johnson County, and we would all get like a duty to like take the food to a certain place. Or like we're gonna take it to the co-op in Iowa City, or we're gonna take it to a restaurant in Solon. So would this be replacing for the farm? Like you guys just come, take like carrots and onions, and then distribute it that way, so it takes that part out, or?
Yeah, I think there's different models of how that can work. Most of the food hubs do own trucks, refrigerated trucks, and they are at least involved in delivering it from their warehouse out to their customers. And I think most of the time, a producer would still need to bring the product to the food hub. But it could probably be worked out otherwise as well. So like, for instance, I will point out with the distribution network here. So on this distribution route, they actually do pick up the dairy at Country View Dairy. So now Country View Dairy doesn't have to go and bring their product anywhere. And so I think that that's something that is another service being offered by food hubs. Thanks for the question. Sophie?
You might not know this, and that's okay, but do you have a sense of what, like how Iowa is doing compared to other states in the U.S.?
Yeah, I generally do, and I wish that I had a better idea. I know that a lot of states have been working on this for more than 2 decades, and Iowa is lagging a little bit in that regards. But that means we have a lot that we can look at other states and learn from, and we have been doing that. And we've also been doing things uniquely here. I think we've learned some things that didn't go well in other states, like, for instance, investing in a statewide, state-owned processing center is not always, it didn't work in Georgia. And so having it be privately owned is a better scenario than, and so we're able to learn from those things. I think that also opens some commentary about where other states are in terms of what their farmers are growing too. I mean, it makes sense that Iowa's a little further behind, but we have lots of room to catch up. Linda?
What is the line between long supply chain and mid-sized supply chain? Is it the state or?
Yeah, I think that's there's a gray zone there. I guess if you could define it based on the income of the farm. You could define it based on the number of intermediary organizations that are going through. But generally speaking, I would define it as being able to be identified to the source of where the food came from once it gets to the end point. That it hasn't gotten lost in translation, in other words. Kathy?
I mean, these other managers, who are they? Are most of these food hubs privately owned, or?
That's a great question. I actually meant to touch on that during my talk. The food hubs in Iowa, they aren't all the same. They're all actually run very differently. I think about 50% of them are for-profit LLCs, and the other half are nonprofits. And so some of the managers are executive directors, and other of them are owners. And then the Iowa Food Co-op is a co-op, so it's cooperatively owned, and they do have a manager who runs the thing. Is there any other follow-up you have on that?
I'm just wondering, is there nationwide, is there one of those 3 options that's more prevalent?
I think it is pretty well split nationwide. I was watching a presentation on food hubs today, actually, in preparing for this, and that they did show that graph where it was national. It was like 38% nonprofit, 42% for-profit, and 20% cooperatively owned.